Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. This is part 6 and the final part of my multi-part series on building an 80s style coin-operated Retroarcade machine. Links to all the other previous parts of this series can be found in the video description, but in part 6 I'm going to focus primarily on the software. At the very end I'll do a little bit of a wrap-up and talk about costs, and I'll also talk about a few things I would do differently if I were to do it over. So let's get started. So at the end of part 5, the cabinet was completely built, everything was wired, and it was ready to go. So part 6 is going to focus primarily on the software. There are two components here on my cabinet, RetroPie and RGBCommander. And I'm going to talk about each of those, and be forewarned, we're going to be taking a look at some configuration files and that kind of stuff. So if you're just interested in my final conclusions and my costs and that kind of stuff, feel free to use these time links here at the bottom, or you can find them down in the video description, as well as finding links to all the previous parts of this series. So as I mentioned, there are two primary components that make up my arcade cabinet. RetroPie, which is the primary system that's going to provide the front end, configuration of your controls, all of the emulators, and basically is going to run the game system. But I also have an add-on called RGBCommander. RGBCommander is going to control the LED lighting of all of those controls and also manage that 8-way to 4-way joystick. So let me start out by talking a little bit about RetroPie. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on the installation or the initial configuration of RetroPie. The RetroPie website, which I'll have a link to down below, has really good documentation. However, there are a few things to be aware of, and I'll show you some of the highlights of RetroPie as well. Just note that I am currently running version 4.3 of RetroPie on my machine, and the most recent version of RetroPie is 4.8, so there might be some slight differences in the current version. So I should mention that RetroPie is not the only option for running your arcade cabinet. There are many alternatives out there, things like Recalbox, Hyperspin, RetroBat. Some of these are multi-platform, so it would be possible to also put a PC inside of your cabinet, and that would be important if you want to run more modern emulators like the PlayStation or Xbox series, but that wasn't what I opted to do in my cabinet, so again, I'm going to focus on RetroPie. So RetroPie itself is made up of multiple components. At the very top is EmulationStation. EmulationStation is going to kind of provide the shell or the menu system for navigating your arcade cabinet. And it can do a lot of other things, such as game metadata, setting screensavers, adjusting volume, and a lot of other options which we'll take a look at in just a second. But underlying EmulationStation is something called RetroArch. Now, RetroArch is more or less going to manage and launch the individual cores or emulators for your games. This was a bit confusing for me because RetroArch allows you to redefine your game controls at either the emulator or the individual game level. We'll take a quick look at that as well. But RetroArch manages and launches individual emulators, or what they call cores. And even amongst those, there are multiple versions. So when you look at something like MAME, which is for arcade games, there are multiple versions of MAME emulators as well. And some games will work better with one emulator versus another. Each emulator also has then what are called ROMs, or individual game files. So I do want to take a brief second to talk about the ROM files, or the game files themselves, and the legality around owning them. So there are a number of game files out there that are open source. There are other manufacturers or copyright owners who have released their games into the public domain, and you should be perfectly fine downloading and using those ROMs. Now, for other ROMs, there's a school of thought that if you own the original game, say an Atari 2600 game, and you have the cartridge, then it's perfectly fine to have the ROM. I am not a lawyer, and so I'm not going to get into that, but you do have to be careful about the idea of illegally downloading other ROM files. It's considered much the same as downloading illegal music. So for that reason, I'm not going to go into any detail on where to obtain your ROMs. It's up to you to do your own research, so please don't ask me down in the comments, and if anybody tries to share illegal ROM sites, I will delete those from the comments. So you need to use your own judgment, do your own research. It is a very gray area. Okay, now that the legal disclaimer's out of the way, let's take a little closer look at EmulationStation. Okay, here you can see the main menu of EmulationStation. Again, it allows you to browse through the different emulators that you have installed, and there are more than I'm showing here. It's just an emulator doesn't show up until you have a game for that particular emulator installed. And this is just a default theme. EmulationStation has literally dozens of different themes or skins you can apply to your EmulationStation and change the overall look of the display. And here you can see some of the menu systems that are available within EmulationStation to help set up your arcade. And the very first time you connect, it's going to prompt you to set up your controls. Now the controls you're setting up here are primarily for the overall EmulationStation. Remember that RetroArch is going to handle the controls for the individual emulators or games. So one thing you'll need to do is be able to navigate around the system, and you'll be able to define some hotkeys or some special administrative buttons. For example, how to exit out of a game back to the menu system. And by using something like a shift key, which you see here, each button can have a second meaning. So think about the shift key on a keyboard where you have a capital A and a lowercase a. By using a shift key, all of your buttons can have a second command within EmulationStation. Another nice feature of EmulationStation is it allows you to create groups of games called collections. So collections allow you to take groups of games from multiple emulators and group them all into its own menu system and its own group of games. So you could take a game from Atari, a game from Sega, a game from the arcades, and put those all together kind of into your own favorites or your own list. Makes it really nice to be able to pull the games that you want to play most together. Another nice feature of EmulationStation is the ability to scrape metadata for all of your installed games. Now, I have heard that development for EmulationStation has ceased, and some of these scrape sites may no longer be up and active, so you'll need to do your own research on that. But for me, I was able to have it scan all of my games. In most cases, it was able to pull in the metadata. So it could pull in box art or even a little video clip, when the game was released, number of players, and some description of the game. And once you have that loaded, then when you launch a game, you see something like this. And I know it's a little bit hard to see here on this particular theme that I've got, but you notice as you select a game, you're getting a little clip of the game itself. And over here in the metadata, you're seeing all of the information on the number of players, the date it was released, and some information on the game itself. And the nice thing is, if the scraper either doesn't find your particular game or you want to edit the information, that you can actually manually edit the metadata for every game through the EmulationStation system. Although you probably will want to hook up a keyboard either via USB or Bluetooth for that particular step. There's a lot more information on EmulationStation. Again, that's available on the RetroPie site or the actual EmulationStation website. I'll leave links to both down in the video description. But for now, let's move on to the next piece of this, which is RetroArch. So if you recall, RetroArch sits underneath EmulationStation. While EmulationStation kind of manages the menu and the themes of your overall arcade, RetroArch is responsible for managing the individual cores or emulators and the controls at that level, or even the controls at the individual game level. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. Just remember that EmulationStation is the menu system level, RetroArch is the emulator and individual game level. There's a lot more information on the RetroPie website and at the RetroArch website, which will be linked down in the video description. So now I'm going to move on to RGBCommander. Now RGBCommander is not part of RetroPie, it's an actual add-on. And it was a wonderful tool developed by an individual whose name is up here that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, but it was needed because Ultimark, as great as their controls are, only provided drivers for the LED lighting and their joysticks for Windows. There was no Linux equivalent. So this individual developed this utility to work primarily with the Ultimark boards and LED lights to be able to control your LED lighting and the joysticks. And here's the RGBCommander site. I will again leave a link down in the video description, but notice on here it says it's unlikely this program will be developed any further. And I will say that the version here, 0.4.0.5, is the same version that I'm using that I downloaded 4 years ago. But it doesn't mean it's not useful. One thing to note is this has no GUI. So we are going to be working with configuration files. So before I get into my particular configuration file, I want to pull up this control board again that I talked about in part 5. And remember that all of your LEDs for all of your controls are going to be connected to these pins on the left and right hand side of the board. And you're going to need to know which button or control is connected to which set of pins. So I would highly recommend that you create a spreadsheet when you're hooking up all of your controls. Because what you're going to need to know for this configuration file, you're going to need to know the name of the pin that the controller is hooked up to. So for in this example, 1SW1, which is player 1, switch or button 1. And again, I've got other information in here, again, what code by default is MAME if I use that shift key. But for the purpose of RGBCommander, we're going to need to know this. We're going to need to know what it's called in RGBCommander. So that's player 1, button 1, and which 3 LED pins that controller is hooked up to. So a spreadsheet like this is going to be invaluable when you start working with the configuration file. So here is my RGBCommander configuration file right off of my arcade machine. And you'll notice right up front there's a lot of documentation. We're not going to go through all this because it would take an hour or multiple hours to do. Just a couple of notes. Anytime you do change this file, you do have to restart RGBCommander. That did bite me more than once that I would forget to do that. A lot of other things here in terms of installation and setup. Note that this does work on things other than RetroPie. It does work with Recalbox and some other systems. Now, a couple of things. RGBCommander, similar to EmulationStation and RetroArch, you can define a default. And basically the default is what lights are going to be lit up and what kind of pattern is going to be happening when the system isn't running a particular emulator or game. It can be static or it can be an animation. I'll talk a little bit about animation files at the end, but it's kind of like an attract pattern. What do you want the buttons to be doing when the system is idle? So here you can see the actual start of my configuration. Again, these are just some general overall options and settings. Primarily, I'm telling it that I'm using RetroArch and I'm using EmulationStation. A couple of other defaults here. As far as my animation pattern, I want it to be random. And more importantly, I'm saying I want my joysticks to default to 8-way joysticks. Then there's a number of color definitions down here. And again, you can add your own here if you want. But then we come down to the actual hardware settings that are in the machine. And again, here are valid names, and it's very important that you follow this naming scheme. This is where we're going to map controls on the Ultimate I/O board to the controls that they're connected to. So if we come down and take a look at mine, again, I'm going to tell it I'm using the Ultimark Ultimate I/O board. And now what I'm doing is I'm going to map each of those controls to the name in RGBCommander. So if you remember from the spreadsheet, I had 1SW1, which were the pins on the board. They were going to be connected to player 1, button 1. And the LEDs for that button are connected to pins 72, 71, and 70 on the board. So I have to go through and repeat that for all my controls. This is where that spreadsheet is invaluable. And again, my trackball, and then I have 4 keys that are always on. So those are the administrative keys at the very top. Remember the hot key, and the shift key, and a tab and escape key. Those 4 administrative keys, those are always turned on, and those are connected to these particular RGB pins. So once all the hardware is defined, we'll get down to the section where the actual magic happens. This is where RGBCommander is going to be able to control the lights of the buttons in your controls and actually control your joystick and set it automatically based on which emulator and game you're running. So first off, there's always a static or a default mapping. This means if all else fails, this is what RGBCommander is going to fall back to. So if you're not using an animation when the game is not in a particular emulator or game, it will show this static default. Then we come down here and we start defining the button settings for individual emulators. So for example, let's take the Atari 2600. If you want your control panel to match the original controllers, it was a single joystick with 1 orange button. So by default, what we have set up here is for Atari 2600, regardless of the game, it's going to use the Atari 2600 emulator defaults. It's going to turn player 1, button 1 orange. It's going to turn everything else off except for a start button and a coin button, which is going to set to white. Now, if you wanted to define different emulations for different games, you could do that. But for things like the Atari 2600, 1 orange button, and then we'd take a look at the Sega Genesis, setting all those buttons to match the gamepad or the controller. Now note that all these were defined. I didn't add any of these. These all came predefined with RGBCommander. So a lot of work went into this. The only thing I did is I did add 2 of my own for Daphne and a TI-99 because those weren't included with RGBCommander. So that's all great for the emulator level, where pretty much like Atari or Nintendo, the buttons are always going to be the same. What about arcade? where every game is going to have a different number and different color of buttons. Well, what's really cool about RGBCommander is there are literally hundreds of individual ROM definitions for arcade games. And if you note here in the description, all of the ROMs defined here are configured to give you the correct number of buttons and the correct color as they appeared on the original arcade cabinet. In addition, it's going to automatically determine, based on information from the file itself, whether to set that joystick to 4-way or 8-way. So as I start to scroll down through this file, you're going to start to see individual games defined. And there are literally hundreds of these predefined. Each game is going to light up the correct number of buttons, again in the right color for the original arcade cabinet. In fact, let me do a quick search here for one of my favorites, which is Track and Field. And if we take a look at the definition, and then I bring up a picture of the original arcade cabinet, you'll notice that the player 1, player 2 buttons are blue and white, which is what these are defined as here. And each player has 3 buttons, white, red, and white. And if you look at my arcade cabinet when I launched this game, here's what's lit on the control panel. Again, white, red, and white for each player. Now notice that in this definition here, you also have player 3 and player 4. That's because some track and field cabinets actually were set for up to 4 players. Now, if you don't have those controls connected on your cabinet, no problem. It'll just be ignored in the configuration file and won't cause any problems. But I can't fathom how much time it took to build this configuration file with all these games, all these configurations, all matching the original cabinet number of buttons and colors. So thank you for developing RGBCommander. So RGBCommander makes setting up all of your LEDs very easy. In fact, I had to do very little other than just tell it what buttons were hooked up to what RGB pins. And it took care of that 4-way to 8-way joystick right out of the box automatically, and I never had to use that toggle switch. Now there is one final part of RGBCommander that I mentioned that I really didn't show, and that's creating custom animation files. And if you remember, by default, my RGBCommander was set up to just run a random pattern. So it's just running random lights when it's not in the middle of the game. But it is possible to define custom animation. And here you see I've created a very simple animation, just where the buttons are lighting in order, red, green, blue, then they all flash blue. It's kind of hard to see the colors here. But you do that by creating something called a custom RGB animation file. And it does have to be done by hand. So this is what one of those custom animation files looks like. Yeah, it's a special type of XML file that defines each frame of the animation, then provides some timing for each frame down below. It's not quite as difficult as it looks here, and if you're interested in creating custom animation or track patterns, I have an entire blog article dedicated on how to do this, and you can find a link for that down in the video description. So that pretty much completes the entire arcade machine. It is now 4 years old. I've done little to no maintenance, have not had to replace any parts on the machine, and it gets used on a regular basis. A couple of other things that I get asked a lot about, first of all, has to do with the cost. And how does the cost of building this myself compare to the cost of buying a retail version? So I tried to keep track of all my costs in a spreadsheet as I went along. But to be honest, there were so many trips back to the hardware store, ordering something else off of Amazon. A lot of times you need one of something, but you've got to buy a 10-pack. Eventually gave up, but approximately, here's what I spent. So the arcade controls themselves were about $625. And as I mentioned in part 1, that's about almost half the cost of the entire cabinet. Lumber and plexiglass, about $165. Now again, that was based on 2018 and the price of lumber today, that amount would probably go up. The vinyl graphics, about $80. Miscellaneous hardware and tools would be things like brackets and screws and, the things I would buy from Menards at the local hardware store. And then about $500 in other parts. That's going to cover things like the speakers, the LED lighting behind the marquee, wiring, the coin door, all the other miscellaneous stuff that went into building the cabinet. So all in, I had about $1,500 into this cabinet. Now, if I were to build one today, again, assuming no price increases there, it would probably cost me about $300 less, because things like a palm router and bits and saw blades, I wouldn't have to buy those again. When you compare that to the cost of a retail cabinet, which again I covered in part 1, at the time we're running anywhere from about $1,800 to over $4,000, and I wasn't getting all the games that I wanted. And so the other thing I get asked a lot is, would I do anything different? Well, overall, I'm pretty happy with the machine, but if there was two things that I would do differently if I were to build it again, one has to do with this marquee area. Just something about it doesn't look right to me. I don't know whether it needed to be a bit narrower or a little bit more rounded off, but I would probably do something to make that look a little bit more authentic. While it looks okay, to me, just something about it looks off. The other thing I would probably do is, since it is a two-player cabinet, I would have went ahead and splurged for a two-player coin door. Not that it's needed, not that you really need two coin slots, just the fact that it would make it look a little bit more authentic if it had two coin slots instead of just the one. So with that, it's finally going to wrap up this multi-part series on building an arcade machine. As I've said repeatedly throughout many of the parts of this, don't be intimidated and don't think that you can't do this on your own. I had no special talents or abilities or skills and had very limited tools and don't really have a workshop. It just takes some patience and some planning, and you too could build one of these arcade machines in your home if you really want one. Once again, check down in the video description for links. I do have a blog dedicated to this entire build process where you can see more photos and get more information. And again, feel free to let me know down in the comments here or in my blog if you have additional questions. If you found anything in this video that you liked or found helpful, do me a favor and hit that like button. That lets both me know that I'm on the right track and lets YouTube know that more people ought to see this video. And if you like my videos, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more, and ding that little bell icon if you want to be notified when I release new videos. As always, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.